Well, hello. Today, we're going to continue in our series of lessons about Vietnam. And our topic today is, what did the Vietnam War look like under the Nixon administration? As we've examined earlier, we understood that in 1968, an election year, that the lead candidate from the Democratic Party was Bobby Kennedy, right? This gentleman here. And Bobby Kennedy was the presumed candidate from the Democrats, very popular amongst youth in particular, and had spoken out very clearly on his stance on Vietnam, indicating that he was what we call a dove, somebody who supported the leaving of U.S. troops from Vietnam. However, on June 6th, 1968, after Bobby Kennedy secures the California primary, thus making him the presumptive candidate for the Democrats, Kennedy is assassinated by Sirhan Sirhan, thus leaving the Democratic Party up to confusion as to who was going to be the next candidate. In the end, the party decides on the man in the middle. And his name is Hubert Humphrey. Now, Hubert Humphrey had been Johnson's vice president and similarly followed Johnson's thinking of continuing into the war. He is nominated officially by the Democrats at the convention in Chicago of 1968, a convention that was filled with chaos and violence in the streets and shown to Americans on TV, all across the country. The Republicans, on the other hand, end up picking a candidate who is quite well known as well, and that's Richard Nixon right here. It's always important for us to keep in mind that Nixon had quite a lengthy political career. He'd served as a representative from the state of California, had served as vice president under Eisenhower, and ran in 1960 to be the presidential candidate from the Republican Party. He ran against John F. Kennedy, Bobby's brother, but lost in the 1960 election. So here we are, fast forward 8 years later, with Richard Nixon running again, and he's running against what is perceived to many as chaos. And Nixon is a tried and true, stable figure, and to many, reflected stability in government. And so Nixon ends up winning the 1968 election. The election of Nixon is really important for us to talk about because we really need to examine his general philosophy. Now, I know that oftentimes, more often than not, Nixon is painted as a villain of American history. I think it's important that we recognize that it's not quite that binary or that simple, one side or the other. There are some things that happened during the Nixon administration that are what we would identify as perhaps positive characteristics or positive attributes of a presidency. So please understand that that's the case. But as a president, when it comes to Vietnam, and that's what we're going to speak about today, I think it's important that you examine where he stood on these issues, and I've highlighted that here on the slides. Nixon believed that it was really important to kind of keep information quiet, which meant that he did not routinely hold press conferences where he was engaging with the press about Vietnam policy. He really wanted to ward off bad public relations, and so he felt that the best way to do that was to not engage with the media whatsoever. Now, the media had routinely engaged during the Kennedy and Johnson presidencies, so this is a little strange and confusing for them, and thus it kind of puts them off on a negative foot with Nixon. Nixon very clearly believed it was his job to focus on on foreign policy and not focus on domestic policy. Foreign policy was his priority, and dealing with Vietnam was his number one priority of all the issues that happen with other countries around the world. I think it's worth noting that for Nixon, his key advisor in Vietnam is a man by the name of Henry Kissinger. Kissinger at one point had been his national security advisor, and keeping in mind that The NSA and the National Security Advisor position itself had been created after World War II to fight against communism. And Kissinger had been his National Security Advisor and then later on serves as Secretary of State, which means that as a cabinet position, his job really is to heavily influence Nixon on what should be done with Vietnam. And so these are Kissinger's suggestions on how to deal with Vietnam. They are suggestions that, in fact, Nixon adopts. The first of these is to seek peace with honor. Kissinger felt it was really important that the United States look for a plan to get out of Vietnam. And he shared that plan. He said that that was our goal, was to get out of the war and to figure out how to get out of the war peaceably without sort of feeling like we were defeatist. Secondly, he believed in what's called Vietnamization. So what is Vietnamization? Vietnamization is the gradual withdrawal of troops. And the intent is that that would happen over time. And in order to do that, right, if you withdraw the troops from an area, there is always that potential or that concern that the loss of American troops in an area will just allow whatever to reestablish, right? We talk about that with World War II, with Korea, still today in South Korea with the fear of North Korea, right? If American troops withdraw from South Korea, is there concern that the communist North will invade? This is, of course, a factor as to why the United States has been in Iraq and Afghanistan for so long, because there is this concern that if you withdraw troops, what will be left but space now to fill back up with the philosophies and the belief systems and governments we were trying to avoid. So in order to do that, Nixon feels that the most important thing that the United States can do is really to train the South Vietnamese to be able to fight the war without the U.S.'s help. And if you look at the troop level chart that I've included on the slide, you'll notice that 1968 here, right, this is the election year. We have over 500,000 troops in Vietnam at this time. By 1969, when Nixon becomes president, that number drops. 1970, we're at 334,000 Americans in Vietnam. 1971, 156,000. And by 1972, which is the next election year, we're at 24,000. So this is what Vietnamization looks like, at least on paper. However, in order to accomplish Vietnamization, and to create a position where the United States can withdraw, Nixon believed that he needed to use military might to move on to this next stage. And that might be counterintuitive to you to say, well, how do you use military might if you're trying to withdraw from war? But per the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, Nixon directly orders military maneuvers, which includes the bombing of neighboring Cambodia. And I should have added Laos, which is right here too. To the north of Cambodia. So the United States government starts flying missions and, in fact, invading into Laos and Cambodia. The question that emerges for folks, including the military and politicians back at home, is can Nixon actually do that? Does the Gulf of Tonkin resolution give him the ability to order maneuvers in these other neighboring countries? So I pulled up the Gulf of Tonkin resolution for you. We've seen part of this slide before, and you read through the resolution earlier. So let's take a look at Section 1. Resolved by the Senate and House of Representatives of the United States of America and Congress assembled, that the Congress approves and supports the determination of the President as Commander-in-Chief to take all necessary measures to repel any armed attack against the forces of the United States and to prevent further aggression. So I want you to kind of pause and to reflect upon whether Section 1 allows Nixon to order troops into Laos and Cambodia and or to bomb Laos and Cambodia. I can tell you that there were some who believed it was fully covered and others who argued that maybe the latitude, the flexibility that the Gulf of Tonkin resolution gives the president, in fact, is maybe just too much and that should be curtailed. As a result, however, of of this military maneuver, we see a series of protests emerge in the United States. And there are two here that I want to address. The more famous of the two is Kent State, which occurred on May 4th, 1970, and Jackson State, which takes place 10 days later. So we're going to watch some video and look at some video clips about Kent State and what happened that day. And then we'll also look at an article about Jackson State.